I promised we would speak more Spanish in Lesson 2, and remember, say these examples right along with me out loud, because not only will that help you get more familiar with Spanish, but it will start to train the muscles in your mouth to speak and pronounce Spanish properly. Here we go. Yo. Yo. Yo abro. Yo abro. Yo abro la puerta. Yo abro la puerta. Tú. Tú. Tú abres. Tú abres. Tú abres la caja. Tú abres la caja. Ella. Ella. Ella abre. Ella abre. Ella abre el regalo. Ella abre el regalo. Ellos. Ellos. Ellos abren. Ellos abren. Ellos abren la tienda. Ellos abren la tienda. In Lesson 2, I get the pleasure of sharing with you the secret to learning Spanish. This is a powerful tool that will not only help you in your early days learning the language, but throughout your life speaking Spanish. The learning outline is as follows. First, I'm going to share the secret with you, so get ready. Then we're going to take a closer look at verbs, vocabulary. We're going to go deeper on subjects. We're going to talk about how to conjugate verbs in the Spanish present tense and a little bit on objects, although objects are a lesson for a different course. And then I'm going to show you some of the books and resources that I recommend for new Spanish speakers, followed by some comprehension. Get ready to have your mind blown because you're about to learn the secret to learning Spanish. Really, the secret is best represented by a simple formula. This formula will go a long way in helping you connect to the Spanish language and will be a great tool to leverage, especially during these early days learning the language. Here is the formula. Now, these are components that you learned about in Lesson 1, which is why Lesson 1 is so important. So first, you have a subject, then you have a verb, and then an object. And together, these three components, they bring about Spanish success. They bring about cognitive language or effective Spanish communication. These are the three basic foundational components that you need to understand in order to communicate in Spanish, in other words. So if you can understand subjects, verbs, and objects, you will be a very effective Spanish speaker. In virtually everything we say, we use some version of this formula. So, the subject-verb-object formula is critical to our learning, but we're going to take a step back and we're going to do a simpler version of this formula, which is best demonstrated by this formula. Subject plus verb equals success. So during Lesson 1, for the most part, we will be focused on this relationship between subjects and verbs and how these two parts of speech come together to form effective Spanish communication. And if you can get this down, this will help you, like I've said many times already, this will really, really help you be a better Spanish speaker. Now, contrast this approach to what many other Spanish courses would have you do, which is memorizing lists of words and phrases and hoping that you're happy doing that. That approach where you memorize lists of words and phrases is somewhat short-sighted in my opinion, because while yes, you may be able to memorize 100 words and phrases, and perhaps you could even navigate a foreign country for a day or two, it's really not going to help you be an effective Spanish speaker. So the approach that I take is to really help you build that foundation in the language so that your vocabulary can essentially be limitless. And you'll see why I say that in just a minute. Let's look at some examples of real Spanish language where we use this subject-verb combination. And again, say these right along with me. Yo. Yo. Yo escribo. Yo escribo. Now, this is a similar example, but this time I've added the object. Yo. Yo. Yo escribo. Yo escribo. Yo escribo un mensaje de texto. Yo escribo un mensaje de texto. I write a text message. I'm not going to get into the mechanics of this example. I'm just exposing you to the principle we're talking about. Él juega. Él juega. Él juega. Okay, that's an example with just subject and verb. Now let's add the object. Tú. Tú. Tú juegas. Tú juegas. Tú juegas con los niños. Tú juegas con los niños. Here's another example with just subject and verb. Ella. Ella. Ella estudia. Ella estudia. And adding the object, ellas. Ellas. Ellas estudian. Ellas estudian. Ellas estudian en los libros. Ellas estudian en los libros. Okay, so the Spanish formula, that foundational secret formula, really could be looked at as the pillars of the Spanish language. These are the pillars that the language is built on. So let's look at each one a little bit closer. First, a subject. And this is a review from the previous lesson, but now that you know that they are the pillars of the Spanish language, it may resonate a little bit stronger with you. So a subject is a noun that partners with a verb and determines how the verb is conjugated. So some examples of subjects are, and you can say these with me, yo, ella, tú, and nosotros. Yo, ella, tú, and nosotros. The second pillar are verbs. Verbs are words of action. They're conjugated when you pair them with a subject. Some examples of verbs are correr. Say these with me. Correr. Viajar. Viajar. And escribir. Escribir. And finally, the third pillar is an object. Objects are nouns that receive the action of the verb. So in those previous examples, things like text message or books. They study in the books. All right, those are objects. Let's look at some examples, and you can say these right along with me. Yo compro la comida. Subject, verb, object. Yo compro la comida. I buy food. Next example. Tú llevas la muñeca. Tú llevas La muñeca. You bring the doll. Subject, verb, object. Next, nosotros estudiamos el arte. Nosotros estudiamos el arte. We study art. Next, ellas comen el pan. Ellas comen el pan. They eat bread. Subject, verb, object. I like to think about verbs the same way I think about one of my favorite foods, potatoes. That's right. Just like there are a lot of ways to prepare and consume potatoes, there are just as many ways to use verbs in the Spanish language. And there's all sorts of different conjugations and uses of the verbs. Don't be overwhelmed by that. You should be motivated and inspired by it, because it means that much of your learning in these early stages will be focused on verbs and verb conjugation. So let's look at a few of the characteristics of a verb. So first, a verb is an action word, like the word run or eat or speak or jump. Verbs are usually easy to visualize. It's easy to visualize in your mind somebody running or somebody eating or somebody playing or a person speaking or somebody cooking food. Those are easy to imagine. Verbs are often paired with subjects. So instead of just saying like run, eat, work, we'll say things like I run, you eat, she works, we play. Verbs come in two forms, the infinitive form and the conjugated form. The infinitive form is like its untouched form. So we don't pair it yet with a subject. To run, to eat, to speak. Conjugated verbs, on the other hand, are paired with subjects, like we run, she eats, and you guys speak. Verbs come in different tenses. What does that mean? Well, it means you use verbs to express the past tense or the future tense or a conditional tense. You would say things like, I studied. You study. So I studied is past tense, you study is present tense. We will study, that's future tense, and she would study, that's conditional tense. Now these last two characteristics are really interesting because they do tend to trip people up. Many verbs are concrete. That means they're really easy to visualize and think about. To eat, to run, to speak, to play, to work, to walk, to drive, to make, to bake, to open. All right, all of those things are pretty easy to visualize. But then there are some vague verbs that are a little bit more challenging to comprehend. These are words like to have. Think about that for a minute. The verb to have, that is a verb. I have, she has, we have. Okay, that's a verb. The verb to be, that's a pretty vague, like that one's hard to visualize. But these are things like I am, we are, they are, she is, he is, that type of thing. Verb tenses are really just spots on a timeline. So for example, there are present tense verbs that are happening now. She studies every day. There are past tense verbs. She studied every day. And those we cover in the intermediate course. And in future, she will study every day. That's covered in the advanced, as well as conditional. She would study every day. The command tense, study every day. And the subjunctive tense, I wish she would study every day. All right, so you can see where in the eSpanish teacher program, we cover each of these tenses. Now, more important than that, though, is this point around every time that you master one of these tenses, your vocabulary automatically increases quite a bit. And you'll start to see this as we go through the course. Because when you learn the present tense for a given verb, like the verb to drive, when you learn the present tense, It's usually pretty easy to learn the past tense, and then it's easy to learn the future tense, and then it's easy to pair those with all the different subjects that you've already been pairing them with. So instead of memorizing long lists of words, which does have its place, focus on the verb-based approach to learning Spanish. So I hope you can see how this focus on verb-based learning is going to be more effective than simply memorizing vocabulary. Now let's talk about verb infinitives, or what I call mother verbs. All right? These verbs are their verbs in the purest, unconjugated form. They have not been paired with a subject. So these are things like cantar, comer, conducir. Say those with me. Cantar, comer, conducir. And notice a characteristic about these three words. We're not going to get into it now, but I want to see if you pick up on the one similarity between these three verb infinitives. Okay, like I said, verb infinitives are not paired with a subject. So you don't say something like nosotros cantar. That doesn't make sense. Verb infinitives are preceded by the word to in English. So to eat, to sing, to drive. For example, we want to sing. That's a practical example of how you would use a verb infinitive in everyday Spanish language. We want to sing. I want to leave. Okay? I'm going to show you three Spanish verb infinitives: hablar, comer, and escribir. Now, I asked you previously, do you notice anything similar about these three words? The similarity that I wanted you to pick up on was this part at the end of each word. Verb infinitives will always end in an AR, ER, or IR ending. So every verb infinitive in Spanish is either an AR verb, an ER verb, or an IR verb. This is really helpful when we start to learn conjugations. Now let me show you the vocabulary for this lesson. This time I'm going to show you the top 10 concrete verbs. These are those verbs that are easy to visualize, easy to think about. And say these, please, say these right along with me. Hablar, hablar. Not hablar, okay? Come away from the English language, the English pronunciation, and start to think in terms of Spanish. And we'll get into a Spanish pronunciation lesson later on. But it's hablar. That H is silent, and the R almost sounds like a D. Hablar. Hablad. If you could say hablad, that's pretty close. It's not quite what we're saying, but it's better than hablar. 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 Comer. Comer. Not comer, com-ed, like com-ed, comer, comer, comer. Escribir, not escribir, escribir, not that, escribir. That B-I-R is almost like you're saying the word bead. Escribir, escribir. Escribir, escuchar, escuchar, not escuchar, escuchar, escuchar. Beber, 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 beber. Trabajar, trabajar. Now, J is not a trabajar. It's a ch. Trabajar. Trabajar. Entender. 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 Aprender. 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 Conocer. 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 That CER on this word is almost like the word said. Conocer. Vivir. Vivir. This is a hard word to pronounce. The V's sound a little bit like English B's. Vivir. vivir, vivir. All right, here are some other verbs that are common and important to know. Enseñar, enseñar. Descubrir, descubrir, descubrir. Andar, andar, andar. Jugar, jugar, jugar. Here are some phrases. Yo como un taco. Yo como un taco. I've highlighted the verb in both Spanish and English in green. ¿Hablas tú con el hombre? ¿Hablas tú con el hombre? Do you speak with the man? Nosotros escribimos las palabras. Nosotros escribimos las palabras. We write the words. Let me take one quick second to talk about pronunciation. By no means are you expected to be able to pronounce the Spanish language properly right now. Not even in 5 lessons from now. Okay? This is something that comes with time. You have to train the muscles in your mouth to speak the Spanish language. It's different than English. And so if we're going through this vocabulary and you're frustrated or discouraged that you're not pronouncing it properly, do not worry. This is something that we'll work on together, we'll get better at, and just know that sometimes I actually show my face as this lesson is going on. I do that with a purpose because it means that we will be pronouncing words, and sometimes it can help you to actually look at my mouth and look at the shapes that I'm making with my mouth, essentially. And in Spanish, they tend to really emphasize their pronunciation. And so you have to put some energy and effort into pronouncing Spanish. There are a lot of English speakers that I know that are really monotone and they just kind of keep their mouth stiff. So some of them will talk like this, they'll talk fast, they don't move their mouth very much, and they don't have any emotion or voice inflection, and it's hard to follow what they're saying. In Spanish, it's much different. They use a lot of voice inflection, they speak with their hand and their face, and so you do have to learn a little bit of that. Okay, so here's that formula. You've seen it before. Technically, a subject and a verb together equal a clause, but I take that one step further and I say a subject and a verb, hey, that is legit Spanish communication. Here are some examples. Okay, we start with the subject and the unconjugated verb here. The subject is you, the unconjugated verb is to eat. Now, when you pair these two words together, you have to drop the to, and in English, it's pretty easy. You just drop to and it becomes you eat. And then the next example is you have she and to eat as the unconjugated verb. She is the subject. But if you want to conjugate those two and pair them together, you've got to drop the to and it becomes she eats. So conjugating verbs in English is actually a pretty simple exercise. All right, so that's one thing that when Spanish speakers learn English, it's kind of a benefit, or it's a pleasant surprise for them. Now, when we learn to conjugate verbs in Spanish, it is a little more complicated, but it's not overly complicated, so don't worry too much. Here is the subject pronoun chart. Okay, so these subject pronouns are common subjects that we'll use in Spanish. We'll use these all the time. We use them all the time in English. Here they are in English. I, you, he, she, it, we, you guys, and they. These are kind of like the base level pronouns. But keep in mind that these can be replaced with words like, instead of saying he, you could say the teacher. Instead of saying she, you could say the attorney, okay? So sometimes we replace these subject pronouns with other words. Here they are in Spanish. We call them pronombres subjetivos. Let's say these together. Yo, tú, él, ella, usted, nosotros, vosotros, ellos, ellas, ustedes. Maybe we'll do that one more time. Yo, tú, él, ella, usted, nosotros, vosotros, or you could say nosotras or vosotras, ellos, ellas, ustedes. If the Spanish language had a capital city, verb conjugation would be that capital city. So what does it mean to conjugate a verb? Generally, what it means is you change it from that verb infinitive that we talked about, that untouched mother verb, you change it to a more specialized or specific meaning. The steps are that you first, in English, you drop that to, okay? You drop that to, you pair the verb with a subject, and then you change the verb's ending slightly. Remember we did that with she eats? We had the subject she and the verb to eat. We had to drop the to from to eat. Then we paired those two words together and we changed the verb's ending slightly from eat to eats. She eats. So here's another example. To sing becomes, when you conjugate it, she sings. Conjugating verbs in the present tense in Spanish, first you identify the subject. This is, who are you talking about? Are you talking about she, I, nosotros, we, them, or they, ellos, ellas? And then you drop that AR, ER, or IR ending from the verb infinitive. You drop it, you just take it right off. And then finally, you add the appropriate conjugation from the standard conjugation charts that I'm about to show you. So get ready. Okay, so on the left, these are the conjugations for AR verbs, and on the right, these are the conjugations in the present tense for ER and IR verbs. All right, so what you would do is you'd look at your subject and you'd say, okay, my subject is, maybe your subject is ella. Then you drop the AR ending from the verb, and you would come down here to these charts, and you'd say, okay, I need present tense AR for ella, which is just the letter A here. You see that in the bottom left corner of the AR verb conjugation chart. And that would be the word, the conjugation that you add to the end of the verb. So if your subject is yo and your verb is an AR verb, you know that you have to conjugate it with the letter O. Okay, so you do those steps that we just talked about. You identify your subject, you drop the AR ending, and you add an O to the end of the verb. Likewise, if your subject is tú, you do the same steps. You identify your subject, which we know is tú, then you drop the ER or IR ending this time from that verb, and you add an ES. So like the verb escribir would be tú escribes. Similar for él, ella, and usted, and for ellos, ellas, ustedes with the AR. So this is just kind of showing you how these charts correspond with each other. Remember, the rule here that's important is that the conjugation or the ending that you choose must agree with your subject. So it's really the subject that dictates the ending that you choose. Okay, so those two have to agree. You can't conjugate something in the yo form and use tú as your subject. All right, let's talk about objects a little bit because they are an important component of this foundational formula or this secret to the Spanish language. The objects receive the action of the verb. They usually come at the end of the sentence. So they complete the clause that we talked about. You've got the subject plus the verb, which is the clause, and the object really kind of ties a nice little bow around that clause and completes the sentence. Like I said, the objects are typically placed at the end of the sentence after the subject and verb. Here are some examples. Yo toco, that's the subject and verb, yo toco. El piano is the subject. Yo toco el piano. I play the piano. Ella me enseña. She teaches me. All right, so this one is a little bit tricky. The reason I'm showing it to you here this early in the course is that at some point you will see this, and I don't want it to confuse you. Ella me enseña could also be said, ella enseña a mí. She teaches me. But this is such a common practice in Spanish that if you've had any exposure to Spanish, if you've watched Spanish television or read Spanish literature, you're going to see this all the time. Here is a pop quiz for some extra points. What does ellos practican mean? I know you probably don't know what practican means, and you may or may not know what ellos means, but just kind of looking at this term or this phrase, what would you guess that it means? If you said they practice, you're correct. Ellos means they, and practican kind of looks like it comes from the verb to practice, which it does. So they practice. Let's do another one. If the chair is the subject of the sentence, to which area of the subject chart would it belong? All right, this is a tricky question, I admit. So think about that subject chart we looked at, and if chair were the subject, where would it fall? Here's the chart. Would it fall in the top right, bottom, middle left? It would fit right there. It's considered an él or an ella or an usted. Okay, that's where kind of the chair, it's like an object, so that's where objects that are singular would fall. I get asked a lot, a lot of students ask me what types of books or resources I would recommend they have to properly learn Spanish. The first resource, of course, is the eSpanish Teacher Beginner Spanish course. But after that, there are some really important books that will help you along the way. So the first book is called 501 Spanish Verbs. This is a reference book. It's not meant to be read cover to cover. It's almost like a Spanish dictionary, but it's focused on verbs instead of vocabulary words. So you can look up any verb. You could look up the verb to walk. You would look it up, and it wouldn't just show you what the verb to walk is translated to in Spanish. No. It shows much, much more than this. It gives you the entire breakdown of the verb andar, which means to walk. It gives you the past tense, both past tenses, the present tense, the future tense. It gives you all of the different subjunctive tenses in Spanish. And it breaks down the verb into each of those. So it actually takes up a whole page of the book to break down one simple verb. And this is an amazing resource because at any time you're questioned about, gosh, how do I conjugate that? Or was there an irregular conjugation on one of these words that I'm not familiar with? This book is that resource for you. The next one that I highly recommend is called 101 Pitfalls in Spanish. And it looks like this. And what this does is it gives you practical examples. So real Spanish language and the areas where new students tend to get tripped up. And, I don't want you to just know about these so that you don't get tripped up. This book, if you can learn the techniques here and you can avoid the pitfalls here, you will sound like an authentic Spanish speaker, or you will sound more like an authentic Spanish speaker. There are certain things that native English speakers will say, and while it may make sense to a Spanish speaker, a native Spanish speaker is going to think like, oh, that's not the authentic way to say it. That's not how we would say it. This book helps to clarify what those are. All right, let's wrap up Lesson 2 with some comprehension. Here is the comprehension exercise for Lesson 2. I realize it looks quite a bit different than what we did in Lesson 1, but this is more typical of what a comprehension exercise will look like. Again, read through the passage on the left, hoping to extract some pieces of meaning. I know you're not going to understand it all, but you should be able to comprehend a little bit of it. And as we go along through the course, you'll comprehend more and more with each lesson. Then I'm going to show you the English translation and help you connect the dots between the Spanish and English so that you can see how the language is constructed. So pause the lesson at this point, read through the Spanish passage. When you're ready, press play and I'll come back on and we'll go through it together. Okay, are you ready? Let's go through it together. Here is the English translation. Let's start on the Spanish side. Yo como y bebo, I eat and drink durante la película. But, mis amigas no comen y no beben nada. All right, so durante la película means during the movie. Pero means but. Mis amigas, my friends, no comen, they don't eat. No comen y no beben nada. They don't eat or drink anything. And then here comes a question. ¿Y qué de mi hermano Juan? And what about my brother Juan? So, ¿y qué means and what about? Or ¿y qué de means what about? Mi hermano means my brother, and Juan means Juan. Él tiene, he has, otros amigos. Otros amigos means some other friends. Y ellos, and they, siempre means always. Siempre llevan, that means, llevar means to bring. Algo para comer, something to eat. Now, I have highlighted the subjects and verbs in red so that you could focus on those. And in addition to understanding how the language is constructed and going through and doing this back and forth exercise, I hope that you took a moment to pick out some really important vocabulary words, because there are some great words in here to remember, and I'll just point those out for you really quickly. Durante, that means during, that's a great word. Película, movie, that's another great word. Pero means but. Nada means nothing or no beben nada means they don't eat or drink anything. So nada is a great word. Hermano. Otros means others or other. Siempre means always. Algo means something. Para comer means to eat. So those are some great vocabulary words in addition to the comprehension that we're doing. That does it for lesson 2. We did speak some more Spanish, right? I hope you're progressing and really enjoying what you're learning. Let's move on to lesson 3.